Okay, welcome back to part 3 of 3 for week 5. I will miss you. I know you'll miss me too. So, as we've discussed, there are two precedence diagramming methods, right? Precedence, successor, predecessor. Successor, predecessor, as we place these activities on the schedule. One is called critical path, and the other is called critical chain, right? So that we don't confuse them. I'm a big fan of Goldratt's critical chain method. If this interests you, he's got a couple of books you'll see in coming slides like critical chain. So critical chain project management, sometimes known as CCPM. This is a method for planning and managing projects. It emphasizes the resources that we've been talking about, people, equipment, physical space, etc., that are required to execute your project. So the critical chain method, though, on the other hand, this is one of those methods used to perform schedule network analysis. Critical chain, critical path are very, very similar, except because they will both determine a critical path. They are similar up to that point. After that, they become different because of the way they deal with the activities. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Now, Goldratt also had he based his whole approach on the theory of constraints, sometimes just called TOC, T-O-C, the theory of constraints. And this was the overall management philosophy of Goldratt, right? He did a book in 1984 called The Goal. If that interests you in your off time, you may want to pick that up, as well as the book Critical Chain, which is an excellent story of supply chain management. So there are 5 basic steps to follow in this theory of constraints that Goldratt would talk about. He'd say identify the constraint, then decide how to exploit or eliminate the constraint, and then subordinate everything else to the constraint. And then at that point, you elevate the constraint and evaluate it and check on it, right? Plan, do, check, act, like Deming would say, P-D-C-A, plan, do, check, act, right? So those are the 5 steps to the theory of constraints, right? And step 1 is to identify the constraint and then decide how to exploit it. So Goldratt would do that by, frankly, in just a basic way. So if an activity had a 10-day duration, he would cut it in half. And he'd say, okay, activity owner, you get 5 days. I'm not saying you're wrong in your estimate. I'm not saying you're bad. I'm just cutting it in half because I think you can do it better. And I'm going to take that other 5 days, and I'm not getting rid of it. I'm going to put it at the end of the project called the buffer. And that buffer is something I get to manage as the project manager instead of you, activity owner, managing the whole thing yourself, right? And he did this for several reasons. He found that activity owners have natural issues, right? It's human nature. Sometimes it's thoughtless optimism, right? Sometimes we just feel like capacity should equal demand. He would consider the student syndrome, right? So when we were students in college, sometimes a paper is due and you knew you had 3 weeks to do it. What do? You start it the night before and pull all-nighter. That's student syndrome. So you're basically doing an activity all at the last minute. You may do multitasking to reduce your time, but that's a distraction, right? Not to focus in detail that you wanted. He would talk of Murphy's Law and Parkinson's Law. Parkinson's Law is an application of the concept that if I have 2 weeks to do an activity and I finish within a week, that I'm going to sit on it. I may review it. I'm not saying I'm sitting on it for the bad reasons. I may want to review it again. I may want to, but I'm not going to turn it in, right? And that's Parkinson's Law. And we want to keep the project moving forward. And for all these other reasons, he applies his principles of the theory of constraints to the critical chain. Okay, and so and this is really Parkinson's Law lived. Do early finishes and late finishes cancel out, right? And the answer is generally no, right? Workers won't admit to finishing early, and resources then become unavailable because you're clogging up the system, the activity owners. So as I mentioned, There are lots of ways to develop the schedule, right? And item 2 and item 3 are just item 1 through 6 are a summary of ways to do it. Item 2 and 3 are where we're focused on right now, critical path method and critical chain. So feel free to review that. Notice item 5, modeling, we talked about earlier. That's that simulation using computer programs and etc. So this is just kind of a summary of these tools to develop the schedule as they impact resources and cost. Okay, so on this slide, we use those approaches to develop the schedule. And as I said, scheduling, cost, and resource management are intimately tied together, cannot really be separated. And of course, we've been focusing on critical chain and critical path at the bottom. Okay, so I'd already mentioned the theory of constraints. These are just some of my final notes on Elihu Goldratt's work. Again, I recommend you pick up the book, The Goal, and also the book, Critical Chain. They are excellent reads. And it's good to have an understanding of his theory of constraints, and he lays those out easily in those works. Now, again, critical chain is a method of scheduling that takes into account limited resources. So remember I mentioned buffers. So if I have an activity that's 10 days, I'm going to cut it in half. I'm going to move that to the end of the project. And that time still exists, but I'm going to measure as a project manager the buffer use rate. That becomes my metric to measuring project success. And so realize when I do that, I am impacting my resource management. So you have to work through those puzzles as we've discussed through these lectures in this chapter, right? And there's a kind of a summary of the buffers in critical chain. Here's a picture of it that I like a lot. So it looks just like critical path method, where you will determine a critical path. But critical chain says, look, these non-critical path items have feeders and they're buffers. And I'm going to take those buffers and I'm going to move it to the end of my project. I'm trying to limit the float or slack on these other activities and make them as tight, really, as the critical path. Keep this whole thing clipping along. And to do so, then I'm managing my resources all the better. Okay, that's all I had for this week. Yay! Some of you say, I've no doubt. But I've enjoyed my time with you. You know my email. I have office hours published and always available. So let me know. Thank you.